Sexual abuse is so shaming that nobody talks about it. Nobody knows how to talk about it. After my father abused my friend, she and I would get back together, and her and I wouldn't even talk about it. When I think back now, it just makes me kind of scratch my head and think, that's just such a unique thing to me that it's such an awful thing that nobody even knows how to talk about it. At school, I pretended to have a normal life, but I felt lonely all the time, and I felt different all the time. Never felt like I fit in. I couldn't make friends with anybody. I was never allowed to participate in an after-school activity, never went to a ball game of any kind, no kind of a sports activity, couldn't take part in anything. I had only so many minutes to get home from school because my father always suspected that I might be out doing something with a boy. It's kind of interesting that guilt always breeds suspicion. Had no friends, and of course I was never allowed to date. I never attended a party. My father would not buy me a graduation dress, a class ring, or senior pictures. He thought all those things were stupid and a waste of money. So then I had to try to explain to my classmates why I never got to do the things that they got to do, never came to anything, never went to anything, couldn't get a class ring, couldn't do this, couldn't do that. And so that was more pretense and making up more stories, and it was just awful, just absolutely awful. I remember a time when I was really young, and they had a Halloween party at school, and my mom didn't know any better, and she didn't have much money anyway, and she bought me this ugly rubber wolf mask. And when all the other little girls showed up, their moms had made them princess costumes, and they were little fairies, and they had all this chiffon, and they all looked so beautiful, and I had my wolf mask. And I remember going and hiding in the corner of the schoolyard because I felt so terrible about the way I looked. It's interesting, the things that you remember. And I can remember being in that corner in that schoolyard just as plain with that old rubber wolf mask on. I think that's kind of the way I felt, like everybody else was a fairy princess and I was the wolf. I had a terrible, shameful secret that was eating me alive. You know, Ginger, I talk a lot of times about the fear, and I think that was one of the most damaging things was I literally just don't ever remember in my childhood not being afraid.
Help us understand what that was like, because there are so many people who are trapped in that now. And what's an example that you can give as that young woman trapped in that lifestyle?
I never felt safe. And I believe that, you know, women especially need to feel safe. They need to be taken care of. I never felt safe. For example, my father worked nights, and so he would go to work about 3 o'clock in the afternoon and get home around midnight. And if I was awake and I would hear his key in the lock, I'd feel that fear because I never knew what he was going to do. Every Saturday night he would go out and get really, really drunk. That was like his big entertainment for the weekend was, you know, he'd finish his work week on Friday, and then every Saturday afternoon, early afternoon, he'd go out and start drinking, and then he'd come home somewhere between midnight and 4 or 5 o'clock the next morning. Even on so-called good days, days when there wasn't some kind of sexual abuse, or days when, you know, he and my mother weren't having real problems. The atmosphere that we lived in was just supercharged with fear because you never knew. There was no stability.
It could turn?
Yeah, there was no stability, so you never knew what might set him off. Mm-hmm. You could do one thing one time and he might be totally fine with it, but depending on his mood, another time it might make him mad. And so basically I lived in a very controlled atmosphere. I mean, he was very much a controller, and I always say, you know, you watched what he wanted to watch on television, you got up when he got up, you went to bed when he went to bed, he decided what the meals were going to be, and you had to eat them, and, even like, I think one of the things that was so damaging to me about the abuse was he would ask me, I mean, like, this sounds pretty crude, but when I was just a young girl, like maybe 8 or 9 years old, he would give me pornography to look at. And then he would ask me to tell him how it made me feel. Well, if I didn't tell him what he wanted to hear, then he'd get mad. And so being a strong choleric, now you got to understand, I'm a strong choleric personality, and cholerics don't do real well with being pushed around to start with. And for me to have to pretend that I liked something that I despised and hated with everything in me, I think that was probably one of the most damaging things to me, was being forced to live that phony. And maybe, you asked me earlier why I'm so open. I never really thought of this till right now. But maybe even just that. Maybe I saw so much phoniness and had to deal with that phoniness and that pretense for so long. Maybe it's just part of God's gift of freedom to me that I don't have to pretend anymore. I can just, I can be open and honest and try to tell people the truth. And because really it's only the truth that makes people free. He always told me that what he did because I was so special and because he loved me. So what I learned that love was a pretty perverted thing. When I was about 9 or 10 years old, I remember my father taking him with me to the house of a female relative and telling me that he was going to have sex with her. And he told me how much she loved it, how good it was. All these things were to encourage me that it was an okay thing to do. And then he would tell me in detail the things that they did. I had to keep lots of secrets. He said everything he did was good and it had to be our secret. And if I told anybody, nobody would understand. They wouldn't believe me anyway, and I would cause lots of problems in the family. It was interesting that I realized this morning it became my burden not to cause any problems in the family because of my pain. And probably one of the single biggest things that I've had to deal with in my life, and still to this day have to stand against it, is a false sense of responsibility. Making myself responsible for things that I should not be responsible for at all. Let me tell you something, I will confront my problem and yours too if I know you have one. I make myself responsible for stuff that's just ridiculous. However, God's done a lot in me in that area, and I'm able to say, Joyce, that's not your responsibility. You don't have to deal with that. How many of you know what I mean by a false sense of responsibility? Well, look at that. The reason why Satan wants us to keep everything hidden is because as long as it's hidden in you, you can never really get free from it. Not completely. And so those things that you have hidden in you, if something you've done that you're ashamed of, or something that was done to you that you're ashamed of, if you've never, ever talked about it, you're not doing yourself a favor. Start by talking to God openly and honestly. Talk to yourself openly and honestly. You have to get it out to get over it.